Girls and boys, the memorial's last post ceremony will begin in a few minutes. The last post ceremony is broadcast on the Australian War Memorial's YouTube channel. Please feel free to take photographs or film the service, and we encourage you to share your photos to the memorial's Facebook page. To maintain the dignity of the service, please consider the following. Please switch off your mobile phones or turn them to silent. Parents should closely supervise young children. Please be respectful and quiet throughout the ceremony and remove hats for the national anthem, the reading of the ode and sounding of the last post. For your safety and that of others, do not sit on the stonework and remove any items placed on the upper ledges. If you are feeling faint or unwell during the ceremony, sit down or approach one of the Visitor Services officers. And in the event of an emergency, follow the directions. Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Dan Hiscock, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Officer Cadet Jack Messenger. This evening, we warmly welcome the family of Flying Officer Arthur Frederick Betteridge, who are watching the live stream of this ceremony. His story will be told shortly. We warmly welcome representatives from the Australian War Widows Incorporated and Air Commodore Mark Lax, retired, representing the Air Force Association. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Return and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Service Clubs Association. And we welcome members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by a representative on behalf of the family, visitors to the memorial, and students on behalf of Runcorn State School from Sunnybank, Queensland. Now, if you're able, I invite you to please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is got by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page, let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains, then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
If you wish to and you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Flying Officer Arthur Frederick Betteridge. Arthur Betteridge was born on the 25th of July 1915 in Smithton, Tasmania. Known as Fred, he was the third of 5 children to watchmaker Arthur Betteridge and his wife Clara. The 2 older Betteridge girls died in childhood, leaving Fred the eldest of 3 siblings. The family remained in Smithton throughout Fred's childhood, where he attended the local public school. Fred's mother died when he was 15, and a year later, his father remarried. He and his new wife, Vera, would go on to have 2 children. After completing his schooling, Fred moved to Melbourne in the late 1930s. Here, he found work as a cost clerk for Australian paper manufacturers and joined the 2nd Field Brigade of the Royal Australian Artillery at St Kilda. In August 1940, Fred married Jean Foster. The couple moved into Woodlands at 179 Royal Parade in Parkville, along with Jean's 4-year-old daughter, Ellen. Fred had enrolled in the Royal Australian Air Force Reserve in July 1940, but enlisted for service in the regular Royal Australian Air Force on the 8th of November 1940 at No. 1 Recruiting Centre in Melbourne. He was mustered as aircrew and travelled to Somers on the Mornington Peninsula to commence his initial training. Fred spent the first 4 months of his enlistment training as a pilot and was promoted to leading aircraftman in January 1941. In early March 1941, Fred's flying training was discontinued, and he was remustered as an observer. He resumed training in Australia, completing his observer course on the 18th of September 1941. Fred was promoted to pilot officer on the 26th of September 1941 and began preparing to depart Australia for the United Kingdom. He embarked from Sydney on the 15th of October 1941 and arrived in England in late December. Fred spent the first half of 1942 in the United Kingdom, during which time he was promoted to flying officer. He joined the RAF headquarters in the Middle East in mid-June 1942, before being posted to No. 454 Squadron, RAAF, in October. 454 Squadron was based in Iran when Fred joined, operating Bristol Blenheims as part of a force intended to counter a German thrust from Caucasus region. After ending 1942, not having flown any operational missions, the squadron returned to Palestine and then Amiria in Egypt in early 1943, where it joined 201 Group of the Royal Air Force's Middle East Command. Equipped with Martin Baltimore's 454 Squadron commenced operations as a maritime patrol squadron in the Mediterranean. The squadron was responsible for targeting enemy submarines and merchant shipping, as well as long-range reconnaissance and occasional strikes against land targets in Crete, southern Greece, and the Greek islands. In July 1943, 454 Squadron was added to a formation of aircraft as part of Operation Thesis. The plan was to carry out a massive combined airstrike against ports and military establishments on the island of Crete to relieve pressure on the Allied invasion of Sicily and avenge the execution of 100 Cretans who had been shot after assisting an Allied commando raid on the island. The Baltimores from 454 Squadron were instructed to attack factories, barracks, and road traffic on the east end of Crete. 8 four-man crews from 454 Squadron were selected for the mission, in what would be their first real bombing action. Flying Officer Fred Betteridge was the navigator in Baltimore FA 409, whose crew was made up of 2 Australians and 2 New Zealanders. The aircraft left their base on the 23rd of July, 1943. Fred's aircraft set off as part of the second wave, armed with 6 250-pound bombs. The aircraft flew low over Crete at a height of 200 feet to avoid alerting the island's defences. Less than halfway to their targets, the 8 aircraft came under heavy ground fire. Crete's landscape gave the enemy an advantage, with terrain masking many potential targets and offering good cover and positioning for anti-aircraft guns. The results of this were disastrous for the exposed Baltimores. 5 of the aircraft were lost over Crete, with 1 crash landing on return and only 2 safely landing back at base outside Tobruk in Libya. Of the 32 men who set out for the mission, only 11 returned unscathed. 1 was wounded in the crash landing of his aircraft, while 6 men were captured by the Germans and 14 were killed. The operation was the worst tragedy in Squadron 454's wartime service. Flying Officer Fred Betteridge aircraft was one of the 5 shot down over Crete. While his other 3 crewmates survived the crash and were taken prisoner of war, Fred was killed during the flying battle on the 23rd of July, 1943. He was 27 years old. Fred's remains were ultimately buried at Suda Bay War Cemetery on Crete. After the war, his Commonwealth War Graves headstone was inscribed with the personal message selected by his grieving wife, Jean. His duty nobly done, loving memories always. His name is also listed on the Roll of Honour on my left, among almost 40,000 Australians who died while serving in the Second World War. His portrait is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Flying Officer Arthur Frederick Betteridge, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
Founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub of Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over, but in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support during the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Good job, Jake. Perfect. Is it fun? Yeah, not too fun.
Nailed it.
Thank you.
How did it feel?
It was actually fun once I was up there.
Yeah.
And once I done the first sort of paragraph, I